Well, folks, the hour has come, and welcome this morning to Faith for Living here on Wednesday morning following a refreshing rain last night and a not-so-refreshing power outage at the hotel. But anyway, here we are, and want to just say, by way of welcome, that following our Faith for Living this morning at 10:30 is our seminar with Reverend John Edgar and his wife Sue Wolf. And if you guys would stand, we can welcome you once again. And John's seminar was very well received yesterday. Part 2 is today. And I know John well enough to know that if you weren't here yesterday and come today, you won't feel left out. Part 2 will be not only a continuation, but a different tack and something that we all will be inspired by. I really encourage you to be part of this seminar because John is inspiring. What they've done in Columbus is amazing, and I believe that Columbus is not unique in that this can be replicated in other churches in other parts of the country. All we need is the energetic and dynamic people like John and Sue to do it, which I think we all have that potential. So just let me say that. The interns have flyers that we're going to pass out, and it looks a lot like the one you received yesterday, but it is different, okay? So this is about a poetry reading by Linda Tuthill and John Fox, and this is coming up Thursday, August 1st. And you know that I'm always promoting things that are coming up, and so this is a Religious Life program that's coming up August 1st. And then I want to remind you that we have recording forms for the series. If you want to hear all of Grace's sermons and in one place, that will come to you on an MP3 file that Mike Malakar will send you, and you can fill out one of the forms that are on the back table for that. I also want to remind you about books. Grace's book is back in the lobby, and Melissa will be selling those after our session today, and John Edgar's book will be out there too following his session. Now, tonight we have the proverbial dilemma of whether the picnic will go on or not due to the potential rain. We'll see about that. All I can tell you is you could look at the website about 3 o'clock and find out whether we're planning on it or not, because we have to get the beans and the hot dogs started about then. So without further ado, I want to have Grace come forward. I want to say again how much we appreciate, Grace, your presence with us and how much you've already shared with us. We so appreciate your presence and your witness to us. You've given us all a lot of things to think about, and I'm sure today will be no exception. So would you welcome again Reverend Grace Mathau.
What a blessing and a gift to be here, and thank you for coming out. I know, especially as some of us who keep an eye on the weather channel, I do appreciate that. I know there will be a storm coming this way sometimes, midday or something like that. So I appreciate your being here. This morning, I have an image of. An image that I tried to get the children in the church I pastored in Kobo Methodist Church, right there on the equator. I had been sent there as their minister, and they had only 8, 9, 10 members of the congregation, and they had said, the bishop had sent me there and said, if you are able to double this membership in a year, we will not close the church, but if you're not able to double it, we will have to close this church. And and so I got there and I told them, everybody, we have a year, everybody have a baby. it was a Methodist congregation set in a very Roman Catholic part of Meru, and so the folks there called me Father Grace, which I liked very much. And so I remember going there, and one of the women who, they did not, I was the only person who was employed in the church, and so I worked both as the custodian as well as the preacher as well as the evangelist, you know. You kind of do all the jobs there. So I used to show up on Saturday to wash the floor of the church and put and set up the hymn books and straighten up the place in readiness for the Sunday. And there was a woman who would come and help me to do this. And she always showed up, and she and I would clean and get ready. And then one day I told her, after a couple of weeks of doing this, I said, you know, I don't know your husband or children. I said, you know, I by then there were quite a few people who had been attending. And she said, well, my husband doesn't come to church. And she was kind of, you know, sad about that. And I said, well, how come? And she said, well, he flunked church. Well, you know, we'll take anybody, you know, to flunk, you have to be really, really bad. And so I said, well, I'm just curious, how could he flunk church? And so she said, well, you'll need to ask him. He did go through catechism, and he failed. And in that time, and it's been about 35 years ago, and I said, well, so you went through catechism, and catechism was 3 years long, and they met every Saturday, and then after the 3 years, you would take an exam, and there were just 5 questions to that exam, and it was very easy. And so he said, well, she said, yeah, he failed that test. So I said, well, how? And said, well, you'll have to ask him. So I said, well, tell him that right after church on Sunday, I will come over. And so right after church that Sunday, I headed on to their home, and I got to the gate, and I heard somebody say, Father Grace is coming. And I heard somebody rushing out the door, back door, you know, slamming. He was out of there. And so began the work, and I tend to be a little bit, you know, zealous. And so this became my new job, you know, to find him. So I once heard he was in the coffee farm. I got myself some gumboots, and I headed out to the coffee farm, and I heard, Father is coming. And there was the coffee farm, you know, the coffee bushes moving as he ran for it. Oh, this was getting good. So I started, and one time I heard he was in the tavern, in the bar. And this was going to be tough because a Methodist pastor, especially at that time, does not allow the shadow of the bar to fall on them, you know, does not even touch a beer bottle, does not even look at a beer bottle. And so there he was. I was on one side of the road. I heard he was in the bar across the road. I thought to myself, WWBD, what would the bishop do? And the bishop at that time was my dad. And I knew my dad was very clear, you do not even look at a beer bottle. I mean, among his testimony was how he had never, ever even looked at a beer bottle. And so I thought, WWJD. So I knew Jesus would hang out with all the wrong people. So I crossed the road and went to the bar. And as soon as I got to the bar, the barkeeper owner was just terrified. And I remember his look. He said, Father Grace, what are you doing here? I said, I have a member in here that I need to talk to. And immediately I heard people running. Some people rushed past me. One guy was going out through the window. And I walked in there, and the marked man was right at the end. He had his beer bottle in front of him. He looked like Jonah, terrified of being thrown out of the ship. And he sat there looking very, very guilty and sad. And I walked right up to him. I sat across from him with that Guinness bottle in between us. Guinness for power, it said, which I had a little theological conversation in my head about. But and so I said to him, I said, I am not here to tell you off. I'm not here to preach to you. I'm not here to judge you. I'm just here because I am super curious. You are the first person in my life that I have heard flunked church. So I just want to ask you, how did you flunk church? What does it take to flunk church? And he said, well, I went through catechism. I said, yes, your wife told me this. I never missed a day, the 3 years. I said, I amazed, that well done. And he said, well, then we took that test, the 5 questions. I said, I know the 5 questions, and I helped grade that test. I mean, there really is no way you could flunk that test. And so I said, well, unless you really tried. And I said, well, and he said, well, I flunked that 5th question. I said, yeah, I know the 5th question. He said, that 5th question says, when Jesus rose from the dead, who was the first to see him alive? Yes, and what did you say? And in my mind, I'm thinking, if you said Peter, you'd get it right. You said Mary Magdalene, you'd get it right. In fact, we used to really be we were grading on a curve. And if you said Thomas, you would even get it right. One of the disciples, if you said Judas, you wouldn't. If you said Adam or Nebuchadnezzar, you wouldn't. But, the intention was not to flunk you. It was just to get you on the ballpark, And so I crossed my fingers and I hoped, oh goodness, what did he say? So I said, well, what did you say? And he said, well, I wrote down, when Jesus rose from the dead, the first to see him alive were the little spiders in the tomb. Isn't that something? He was reading between the lines. Oh my goodness. So I'm sitting there at the bar, I'm crying. I'm just overwhelmed with emotion. I'm just thinking, yes, this idea of having such an anthropomorphic God, where we actually don't realize that God who creates, the 5 days of creation, the calling to be stewards, that resurrection is for the birds that no longer have a place to perch, for this creation that God dwelled on, that we are told there is extinction of species. Are we not weeping? That our concern is just for us, the stewards? That we were called to be stewards of God's creation? To celebrate that this resurrection is for the rivers, for the trees. That Jesus' resurrection is overwhelming. Oh, I'm sitting there with a beer bottle between us, weeping, having my own second altar call, giving my life to Christ a second, a third, a fourth time, having this this expansion of what it is to be a beloved child of God, to be called, to be human in this time. So I told the guy, I said, you know what? Oh, I'm here to repent on behalf of the church, of the grading, of catechism. I am here to apologize. I am here to say, on Sunday, you come and bring the card. You know, everybody had to have these cards that before you had communion, you had to have your card. And before you got buried, we had to look at your card to see how many times you're taking communion. It was fortunately, that doesn't happen anymore, but it was a very strict system on that. I said, bring your card, bring your card. He still had his card, which had not been stamped. We stamped it and just went back and wrote the day that he was supposed to have gotten it stamped. Wrote that down and he began. At this time, he is the chair of that church. Oh, I should bring that picture of that church that he has been chairing for the last few years, and how he has worked hard, and how they have rebuilt that little single-room church into this amazing building, which has got education rooms, which has got classrooms for recovery, which has got so much is going on in that building. And when I was in Kenya, loved meeting him and retelling that story of, do you remember when I walked in the bar that day? And he said, I looked at the window. Unfortunately, I couldn't move fast enough, to get out of the window. And we talk about the beer bottle sitting between us. And we laugh and talk, and about this Jesus who comes to us crossing the road. And there some of us discover that we were not the ones going to seek those who were lost, that we indeed had been the ones who were lost, and God comes to seek us. I gave an image when I was in that church of this picture. I was trying to get the people to think about God in bigger images. And I said to them, especially to the children, I said, when I look at this picture, this is for me the image that reminds me of God. If I had to paint a picture of God, this would be what I would paint. This, to me, is the image of God. Imagine my surprise when one of the children came and said to me, which one of those children is the one that is God to you? Is it, which one? I had assumed it was obviously the mother. And somebody might say, oh, it's the bicycle. Somebody might say it's the wood. And one of the children asked me, which one of those is the image of God? And so I love this image because it keeps reminding me that we indeed, all of us see, but we see different things. And maybe the gift in our being together is the gift of conversation and making it much more powerful than we initially saw it. This morning, I want to, I've set my clock so that you can have at least 10 minutes of response, questions, conversation. I want to read two texts that I want to work with this morning. One of them is from Ruth chapter 16. But Ruth said, do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. And then my absolute favorite scripture. Oh, I love this scripture. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Aram, and Aram the father of Aminadab, and Aminadab the father of Nahashon, and Nahashon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of the deportation. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Salathiel, and Salathiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud, and Abiud the father of Eliakim, and Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Matthan, and Matthan the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. Don't you just love that? The word of God for the people of God. The book of Ruth. There are only 2 books in the Bible that are named after women. The book of Esther, and Esther was a queen, so that makes sense. And the book of Ruth. And I don't know about you, because that makes no sense, because Ruth was a nobody, really. We don't even know who her parents were. The book of Ruth. The book of Ruth doesn't begin with Ruth. The book of Ruth begins in the Holy Land, and there's a famine in the Holy Land. And the famine triggers what most traumatic events in homelands trigger, a migration. That's not a unique situation. For instance, 179 years ago, in 1845, we're told in Ireland, the potato famine, 1 million dead, and those who could got on ships and headed to America. And we are told between the years 1845 and 1852, 1.5 million Irish people had immigrated to America, fleeing the potato famine. This idea of immigration still with us today, asylum seekers fleeing political and economic conditions in their countries of origin. And so the story of Ruth begins with a familiar situation. There is a famine in the Holy Land. And a man named Elimelech, who has a wife and 2 sons, decide to immigrate. I love the name Elimelech. It means, my God is king. And that's the way I'm going to call him. I won't call him Mr. Elimelech. I'll call him Mr. My God is king. Mr. My God is king takes his wife and his 2 sons, and they flee to the neighboring country of Moab. That should shock us, because nobody goes to Moab. There are stories and rumors about Moab and Moabites that you cannot tell in mixed company. In fact, I think if you ever spoke Moab or Moabite, you would need to spit. If there was a book of discipline by the Methodist Church, United Methodist Church, it would say, being a Moabite is incompatible with God's grace. And so, but they look and see the choice between death or Moab, and Mr. God is my king chooses to save his family, and they immigrate to Moab. They immigrate to the land that is despised, filled with people who are despised, with scornful stories. Mr. My God is King is married to a woman named Naomi. What a wonderful name. Naomi means pleasant. She is Miss Pleasant. Can you see us introducing the couple here at Lakeside? At that cottage lives Mr. God is my King and his wife, Miss Pleasant. Oh, you just want to be in their home, don't you? But the irony of it, Mr. God is my King is going to die in a land where God is not king. And Miss Pleasant, by the end of the story, is going to say, change my name to Miss Bitter. Now, right away, the first two verses of the story clue us that this story is not going to end well. They have two sons, and they name their sons Mahlon and Chilion. One is named Sickness. Who names their child Sickness? Can you see the roll call? Isaiah, present. Nehemiah, present. Adam, present. Eve, present. Sickness, absent. Why? He's sick. And so you know right away, this story is not going well. They escape to the Moab, where Mr. and Mrs. God is King, continue, and in just the third sentence of the story, Mr. My God is King dies. The story gives no explanation. He dies. We have no idea why. We're just told he dies. No information, no mourners. We do not know who led the Kaddish for him. He dies, and they bury him in Moab. Mr. My God is King's final resting place is where his God is not king. Miss Pleasant raises the two sons. When they're old enough to marry, they marry indigenous women. They marry Moabite women. One named Ruth, the other named Orpah. And we know the story of Oprah, how her mother wanted to name her Orpah, but there was a clerical error and her name was misspelled, and so she became Oprah. I think her mother should have named her Ruth. But back to the story, Miss Pleasant's sons marry Moabite women, and it's a shock if you've done your work on how the Moabites should be or are thought to be. It's so offensive. Let me try to offend you, to show you how offensive this is. When I was growing up on the slopes of Mount Kenya, we would read about the United States history, and we'd read about the Native Americans. And we learned that Native American women are called squaws. Now, I hardly knew any English, but we learned that Native American women are not women. They are strange, exotic, inhuman. They have a different name. Squaw. Ruth and Moab and Orpah, indigenous women. That offensive. Truth is, There is such a huge chasm between Miss Pleasant's people and her daughter-in-law. Such a big chasm that it will take fierce compassion for us to bridge such a chasm. We're told then after 10 or so years, there is an illness that spreads. Now, because I'm one of those storytellers who loves a good story and the details of a good story and digging and doing the archaeological work of a story, I am so surprised that there is no in this union, there are no children. And so I have been working hard to find, but no scholar in my research so far speaks of why they were married for 10 years and there were no children born. No one speaks of it, so I won't speak of it. And then, boom, there's an illness through the land. Everyone gets sick. Miss Pleasant gets sick. Both sons get sick. Opa gets sick. Ruth gets sick. And when the sickness passes, Miss Pleasant recovers. Opa recovers. Ruth recovers. But the sons do not recover. And that's early. We're only in verse 5 in chapter 1. Mahlon and Chilion have died. We're not told who buried them, who did the Kaddish for them. I guess it was their mother, because she is the only one in this time in the story who prays to the God of Abraham. The story is ruthless, pardon the pun. And the woman, we are told, is left without her 2 sons and her husband. And so the story of Ruth is birthed in trauma. The famine, living in a foreign land, death, abandonment, it's too much. In a course I took with Gabor Mate called Trauma and Spirituality, our instructor, Dr. Mate, began by first explaining the word trauma itself originates from the Greek word for wound. Trauma is a wound. And according to Dr. Mate, trauma is the wound inside us. And he says that is very good news. You see, trauma is not what happens to you. Those are traumatic events. Trauma is what happens inside you, the wound that one sustains from traumatic events. And the good news is that because trauma is a wound, trauma can be healed. According to Dr. Mate, you cannot change the traumatic events that happened to you. Those things happened, and there's nothing you can do about the things that happened to you. But you can heal with the thing that happened in you. Naomi can speak about the traumatic events. The famine in her homeland is a traumatic event. Leaving of home is a traumatic event. The migrating to a land of a people who they despise is a traumatic event. The death of her husband is a traumatic event. The death of son number 1 and son number 2 is a traumatic event. These traumatic events that wound Naomi, Miss Pleasant, so deeply. The trauma is in her. Dr. Gabor Mate speaks of our need to make sense of traumatic events. We ask, why is this happening to me? So Naomi wonders, why are these traumatic events happening to me? And in chapter 1, verse 13, she makes this tragic statement. She tries to make sense of the traumatic events, and she comes up with this tragic statement. Quote, "The hand of the Lord has turned against me." imagine thinking that these traumatic events is something God is doing to me. When bad things happen to good people, either God caused the bad things to happen or God willingly did not stop the bad things from happening, says someone. It's overwhelming when we throw God into the mix of traumatic events. What are the options? Someone might say, I'm going to turn my back on God. Why bother believing or loving a cruel God or an impotent God? I do not believe in God anymore. And worse yet, someone might think, if God allowed these bad things to happen to me, surely it must mean that I deserve it. Conclusion, I am a bad person, and I deserve these bad things to happen to me. That is trying to make sense with traumatic events that overwhelm us, that Naomi is trying to make sense of these traumatic events. Another one of our instructors in that trauma and spirituality class, Dr. Hamid Ali, explained that the wound in us, the trauma in us, is transformed and healed only in the presence of what Dr. Hamid called fierce compassion. According to Dr. Ali, only fierce compassion can heal our wound. The kind of compassion that is intense, extreme, profound, compassion that is forceful, aggressive, defiant. Fierce compassion is when someone sees you and does not judge you, when someone receives you wholeheartedly, allows you to feel safe enough to be vulnerable, so that the truth about you is born. Fierce compassion gives us room so that we are willing to go beyond who we thought we are and find our authentic self. Fierce compassion gives us a wide berth so that we can be brave enough to fail. Brave enough to fail. Fierce compassion allows us to feel again in the knowledge that we have someone there to help us regulate our emotions so that we will not be overwhelmed. Fierce compassion creates space so that we no longer have to harden ourselves, so that we do not feel the kind of pain we felt when those traumatic events overwhelmed us in the past. Fierce compassion allows us to know we are much more than we imagined ourselves to be. That is who Ruth is in the story. Ruth, her name means compassion. She is the companion to Naomi who has fierce compassion. And so the picture before us, a Moabite woman clinging to a Judean woman, not holding, not hugging, but clinging. She is Velcro. She is chewing gum on the sole of Naomi's sandals. Ruth tells Naomi, I'm all in. You go, I go. You lodge, I lodge. Your people, my people. Your God, my God. Your cemetery, my cemetery. Does Ruth's story seem familiar? Of course it does. This is the story that God tells us in the story of Jesus. This is the story of God who clings on tightly to us. God who takes on our humanity, becomes human like us to cling to us. Ruth is the Christ figure in this story. Ruth, who is Jesus' great, 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 say that 46 times, great grandmother. Ruth is the one who is the Christ figure in this story. Miss Pleasant, you see, what happened in your life happens. Traumatic events are part of life. Bad things happen to good people and to bad people. And bad things happen to people, period. And faith is not some vaccine that protects you from bad things. And going to church is not a booster that protects you from bad things. What faith promises us, and what church or community of faith promises us, is God's fierce compassion, that we are reminded about this God who clings to us, who is our companion. Now, I have a favorite scripture that I read to you from Matthew, where a few years ago in a church I was serving in Wisconsin, I read that text on Christmas Eve service. I don't know why I thought that was a good idea. It was not. To this day, they remember that. And Christmas Eve, I came to realize, is a service you do not want to mess with. The snow is gently falling outside. People are dressed in their reds and greens. The CEOs are there, Christmas, Easter only. Everybody is there. Some of them are there because they're there for the sake of grandma. They know what to expect. Angels, shepherds, wise men, a virgin, a baby. And then they leave. They first sing, O come, O ye faithful. Everybody knows the hymn. Do not have new hymns on Christmas Eve. Again, nobody told me this in seminary. I learned about it the hard way. And no, that's not why I was moved from that church. And at the end, everybody knows you light your candle and you sing Silent Night. We don't expect much on Christmas Eve, that's all. Nobody remembers the sermon as long as you keep it short. And then I remember, I got so excited that Christmas Eve, I had to read to them that Matthew chapter 1. I had to. It's so good. It's so good. I just thought they were missing out. It's not begats. That's just been a way of dismissing it. It's a parade. I was so excited to tell them about this parade that happens before Jesus is born. You know, this parade where Matthew brings out, it's almost like July 4th. It's before the baby comes. We have this amazing parade. And I'm there waving at all these people as they come through the parade. And everybody else is sitting there, not very happy. And the parade is filled with the good, the bad, the ugly. Look at that. King David shows up. You know, the sexiest man alive. and Solomon, King Solomon, making Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos look poor. and look at Jacob. Jacob, he's limping. His limp is almost like the scar on Harry Potter's face, you know? He's the one who actually wrestled with God and lived to tell about it. And over there is Bathsheba, Uriah's wife. She is a reminder of how women are victims of war in more than one way. And there she comes, Ruth. She's so different. She's an immigrant woman from south of the border. Does she even have papers? Matthew's parade, everyone there. Everyone who is Jesus' human DNA displayed. And if you love that gift God has given us in the gift of science, you then begin to see that none of us is self-made. That even Jesus has got this generation after generation after generation after generation where they're looking and saying, oh, he's got Jesus' forehead. Oh, look at that. That's his great-great-great-grandfather. Oh, look at, oh my goodness, doesn't he look like his great-great-grandfather? Look at that. That every one of us, including me, every one of us is this amazing, amazing miracle that has been passed on from generation to generation to generation. That you didn't just happen. I mean, have you looked at yourself in the mirror lately and thought, I didn't just happen. Now, I could have lost a couple of things here and there, but, natural selection, I get it. That each one of us, this incredible miracle, all of them, God's presence shining in this amazing gift. Van Bogart, in his book, God with Us, writes, I am convinced that God's presence with us is not only in our religious experiences, but in the whole range of our humanity. God's parade. All of them, name after name after name after name, is really a shorthand of story after story after story. This Heilsgeschichte, this Heilgeschichte, the salvation history of God, that Matthew begins his gospel with, saying, before I get to Jesus, I will first tell you this parade of God's salvation history, and you will be surprised. Among them, I will include Ruth, the Moabite. And then comes Jesus, the Messiah. And since Matthew's writing of that parade, the parade has been added to Peter and John and Andrew and Bartimaeus and Lazarus and Mary and Martha and Mary of Magdala, the first preacher on Easter morning. And Fortina, the luminous one. Who is she? The Samaritan woman at the well. Yeah, she did have a name. And Paul and Silas and Augustine and Wesley, the parade has continued to grow. Sarah Cosby and Francis Asbury and Harry Hozier and Jorina Lee and Georgia Harkness and MLK and Bishop Tutu and Charlie Yost and you and me. Some of us born out of some trauma, and yet the resilient ones. I'll use Eric Ritson, who in his book, Resilience, Hard-Won Wisdom for Living a Better Life, writes, quote, life's reality is that we cannot bounce back. We cannot bounce back because we cannot go back in the time to the people we used to be. The parent who loses a child never bounces back. The 19-year-old who sails for war is gone forever, even if he returns. You know that there is no bouncing back. There is only moving through. What happens to us becomes a part of us. Resilient people do not bounce back from hard experiences. They find healthy ways to integrate them into their lives. In time, people find that great calamity met with great spirit, can create great strength. It's another way of talking about trauma, traumatic events, and the healing of trauma, all of them in this parade. And there is my favorite one. There is my favorite one, Ruth the Moabite, on that parade, heading to the Jesus story. Ruth the Moabite, Ruth the Moabite, Ruth the Moabite, the fierce, compassionate companion who heals Naomi's trauma, who heals our trauma. Thanks be to God. Amen.